A council of war was held inside a tent. Outside, the Egyptian heat beat down upon the assembled Mamluk soldiers who shifted uncomfortably in the stifling atmosphere. Their future, perhaps the fate of all Islam, rested on the decisions made within the tent. But what were these men who held the power to stop the Mongol horde? What were the Mamluks? Inside the tent, seated on cushions, were some of the most powerful men in the Islamic world. At the center of attention was the Sultan Qutuz, once a slave and now master of many. He had come to power only 3 years ago when he led a rebellion against the previous sultan, Malik al-Aziz Othman, seizing the throne after a violent palace coup. Now, Qutuz found himself facing a threat far more dangerous than any rival claimant to the throne. To the north, across the Jezreel Valley, was the amassed horde of the great Khan, Mongol, who was attempting to subjugate the whole of the Middle East. Behind him stood the man who would soon become famous throughout the Middle East, Baybars, a slave turned Mamluk warrior turned commander of the elite guard of the Sultan. Now, he stood with arms crossed, silently observing the debate before him. Across from them sat the emirs, commanders of the Mamluk armies, each eager to prove himself worthy of the Sultan's favor. Between them was a map spread out depicting the region around them, centered on the valley they currently inhabited. It was here that the great battle against the Mongols would take place. But who exactly were the Mamluks? The word Mamluk means owned ones, those who are possessed. They were slaves bought by the Muslim rulers of Egypt, trained from childhood to fight as elite shock troops. Once freed, they formed an elite military caste, loyal only to the Sultan, forming the backbone of his army. But while slave soldiers had been used throughout history, the Mamluks were unique. They were able to rise above their masters and rule over the whole of Egypt. When Qutuz came to power, he found the country in sharp decline. From trade to the military, everything was in need of reform. But one thing he did not touch was the slave trade. In fact, he even increased the number of slaves imported into the country. This caused resentment amongst some of his fellow Muslims who felt the foreigners were being favored over them. But Qutuz knew what he was doing. He knew that the defense of the realm, the very survival of Egypt, rested on the shoulders of these same foreigners. As the meeting continued, Qutuz could see the tension building in the room. Some of the older emirs wanted to flee to Cairo and fortify the city, believing there was no way they could win in the open field against the Mongols. He knew he had to do something to rally them. So he rose from his seat, grabbed the map, and pointed to the road leading to Syria. "This is our only chance," he declared. "If we do not strike them now, they will be upon us in Cairo." His advisors murmured amongst themselves, voicing their concerns about the massive Mongol army. Qutuz raised his hand for silence. "They may have more men, but we have the cavalry to beat them. God is on our side," he said, referring to the Muslim belief that God chose the sword of the Muslims to spread the message of Islam. Some of the men nodded their heads in approval. Qutuz continued, "We will meet them near the village of Ain Jalut. We will give them no quarter." At dawn the next day, the Mamluk army set out. The Egyptian soldiers rode on fine Arabian steeds, wearing fine chainmail and helmets. They carried scimitars and long spears. Amongst them were elite units armed with bows and arrows and others carrying catapults. At their head rode Qutuz, followed closely by Baybars. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the dust rising off the Jezreel Valley floor, the men began to tire. By midday, they reached their destination, a small rise overlooking the valley below. There, they pitched camp and waited. All the while, the men grew more anxious. Each knew in their heart that what they faced was unlike anything they'd ever seen before. As the afternoon wore on, the men became restless. Suddenly, the lookout shouted, "The enemy has been spotted." From atop the rise, they could see the Mongols massing in the valley below, a sea of horsemen bearing down on them. Soon, they were close enough to make out the banners of the horde. Qutuz turned to his men. "It is time." With a nod, Baybars led the charge, riding at the head of his men down the slope. As they gained momentum, they reached the bottom of the rise and charged across the valley. The Mongols were taken by surprise and were caught in the open. For a moment, the Mamluks had the advantage, but suddenly, just as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished behind a ridge. The Mongol commander, Kitbuka, realized it was a trick and ordered his men to follow. They rounded the ridge to find the Mamluk army waiting for them, this time hidden from view. In the center of the formation was a group of horsemen. They were too disciplined, too well organized, and he knew then he wasn't facing ordinary slave soldiers. The two armies met in the center of the valley. Swords clashed and bodies fell. Bows twanged and arrows flew through the air, finding their marks. Screams filled the air as men fell wounded to the ground. Qutuz fought bravely, but the Mongol horde was too strong. Soon he found himself pressed back towards his camp. Fighting desperately, he managed to reach the safety of his tent. Meanwhile, Baybars had a different problem. While he'd been fighting alongside the Sultan, he'd noticed something disturbing. A large group of Mongol horsemen were racing towards the baggage train. Without hesitation, he abandoned the fight and raced across the battlefield to intercept them. The Mamluk assault had broken the Mongol lines, allowing Baybars to slip past and plunder the riches of the Mongol horde. Finding Qutuz alive, he spared him and chained him up. Then he led the rest of the Mamluks back to the fight. Seeing their supplies gone, the Mongols fought with renewed vigor. Even though the tide of battle had turned against them, the Mamluk cavalry remained steadfast, refusing to yield an inch. They fought until every Mongol was dead, the ground littered with the riches of the Orient and the bodies of the Mongol horde. Only a few Mamluks remained alive, yet somehow they held. In the end, only 3,000 Mamluk soldiers were left, but they had stopped the Mongol advance into Egypt. Back at Cairo, Qutuz paraded the surviving Mongols before him. Many were too injured to stand, their faces streaked with sweat and blood. Every one of them was missing something: an ear, a nose, a finger. Their lips slit from ear to ear. Qutuz eyed them suspiciously. "Where is your great Khan?" he asked, his voice echoing through the courtyard. One of the captives looked back defiantly. "He is dead," he spat. As the weeks passed, the full extent of the battle became clear. The Mamluks had won a great victory, but at what cost? Thousands of men were lost. The horde had been defeated, but their commander, Kitbuka, was still alive. He'd escaped with a handful of men. But Qutuz knew that the great Khan would soon send another army. Meanwhile, the victors celebrated. Banquets were held and poems composed celebrating their glorious victory. But Baybars noticed that Qutuz was troubled. He found the Sultan pacing his palace in Cairo. "What troubles you, my lord?" he asked. Qutuz looked up, his eyes haunted. "I fear the worst is yet to come. Kitbuka lives. I saw it in his eyes as he died. He will return," he said. Baybars placed a comforting hand on his Sultan's shoulder. "Do not worry, my lord. As long as I live, no harm will come to you or Egypt." Qutuz nodded his thanks, but both men knew that the coming years would be filled with bloodshed. And so it proved. A few months later, Qutuz received word that Kitbuka was amassing a new army. The Sultan panicked and fled Cairo for the safety of his palace in Damascus. Baybars, however, refused to abandon his post. He rallied the remaining Mamluk troops and awaited the Mongol attack. When they came, he led the Mamluk cavalry out to meet them. But as the two armies clashed, something terrible happened. Qutuz was killed in the fighting, his head cut off and sent back to Cairo as a warning. But Baybars would have none of it. He picked up the severed head, kissed it on the forehead, and placed it on a cushion. He then sent it back to Damascus for burial. No one knows what he was thinking, but it would seem he had designs on the throne. With Qutuz gone, Baybars took the title of Sultan. Under his reign, the Mamluk would go on to defeat the Crusaders, ending their hold on the Holy Land. But that's a story for another time. Now it's your turn. Tell me in the comments what surprised you the most about the Mamluk army. The weapons they used, their tactics, or maybe how they came to power. If you enjoyed this episode, check out my series on the Black Death. Thanks for watching.